Our second reading this morning is from the Hebrew Scriptures, or Old Testament, beginning at chapter 1, verse 20. Proverbs was indeed written for the purpose of education, probably educating young people at the temple. Wisdom cries out in the street. In the squares, she raises her voice. At the busiest corner, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates, she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing, and fools hate knowledge? Give heed to my reproof. I will pour out my thoughts to you. I will make my words known to you. Because I have called you, and you refused, have stretched out my hand, and no one heeded, and because you have ignored all my counsel, and would have none of my reproof, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when panic strikes you, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. Then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me. Because they hated knowledge and did not choose fear of the Lord, would have none of my counsel and despised all my reproof. Therefore, they shall eat the fruit of their way and be sated with their own devices. For waywardness kills the simple, and the complacency of fools destroys them. But those who listen to me will be secure and will live at ease without dread of disaster. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Wisdom is a woman. The Bible tells me so. The book of Proverbs is the part of the Bible, it's part of the Bible we call wisdom literature. Tradition tells us it was written by King Solomon. Now, supposedly, Solomon wrote 3 books of the Bible. Tradition tells us Solomon wrote the Song of Songs, easily the sexiest book in the Bible, when he was a young, hot-blooded man. And as his life drew to a close, when his blood was running cold in his veins, Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, which tells us that all is vanity, and for everything there is a season, even death. But it was in midlife, when his blood was temperate and he had some real experience of the world, supposedly, that Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs, probably for the purpose of education. That's the book we dip into today. And here in the first chapter, straight out of the gate, the king who legend and scripture tell us had in excess of 1,000 wives, Solomon makes his case that wisdom is a woman. I tried to ponder this week exactly what my earliest understanding of wisdom was. I think it's a hard concept for young people to grasp. I think I always connected it, early on anyway, with quiet and contemplation. I also connected it with certain spaces, a church certainly, but also nature. The depths of the ocean reminded me of wisdom, but also the deep umbrella that is a space under a weeping willow. Also the summit of a mountain, a place that gives you a broad vista, or as Anne with an E might say, scope for the imagination. Woman wisdom doesn't seem to share any of these notions. She comes charging at us on a city street. Think East Main at about 5 in the afternoon. Everyone rushing somewhere, people foolishly trying to cross. She uses her voice to take charge at the gates of the city. Wisdom, apparently, is not something only for quiet and reflective times. Kathleen O'Connor, a professor of Old Testament at Columbia Seminary, tells us, these are the sites of communal life, of the bustling relationships of daily life. This is where wisdom demands to be heard, not in the privacy of homes, the sacredness of the temple, or even the quiet recesses of souls. She calls for allegiance smack in the thick of work and play, at busy intersections where people gather, and at the city gates where legal and commercial deals take place. Ordinary life, with its drama and busy social exchanges, with its joys and disappointments, is wisdom's domain. In this mundane life is the hallowed space, the sacred ground, where one may encounter wisdom itself, if one is attentive. I'm going to say that last line again. Mundane life is the hallowed space, the sacred ground, where we may encounter wisdom itself, or herself. I also want to say this. Lady Wisdom isn't much concerned with manners in this passage. She feels free to resort to name-calling. In fact, wisdom has many of the characteristics of a prophet. Now, a reminder, prophets are not fortune tellers. Prophets are truth tellers. We get confused and we think that prophets are fortune tellers because sometimes they tell us what's going to happen if we stay on the same course we are presently following. But that's what prophetic truth telling is able to do. It assesses the situation and then tells us what will unfold unless we heed their warnings. This is what wisdom does. She looks at those she calls simple or scoffers, those who don't or won't listen to her voice, and she tells them to listen to her voice. If they don't, she predicts panic coming like a storm, calamity descending like a whirlwind, distress and anguish overwhelming them. It sounds really harsh. When giving words of warning, prophets tend to be harsh because they're always offering another, better way. And they're using everything in their verbal and rhetorical arsenal to persuade their listeners to change before it's too late. There is God's wisdom, she says, and there is folly. You have to choose. The tone wisdom uses here is very similar to Jesus in the passage Doug just read for us from the Gospel according to Mark. In the first part of the passage, Jesus is questioning his disciples. Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And when the answer from his followers is the Messiah, which is to say God's anointed one, sent to the descendants of Abraham and Sarah, Jesus doesn't He doesn't contradict them, but he does silence them. He tells them it isn't quite the right time to say that out loud, not yet. And then Peter takes Jesus aside and lambastes him. He rebukes him. Peter rebukes Jesus. And then this is the part I'm talking about. This is when Jesus sounds a lot like Lady Wisdom, the get behind me Satan part. For the record, Satan is a Hebrew word that means tempter. That's how Jesus is using it here. Out of my sight, tempter, Jesus is saying. You're ashamed of my words? You rebuke my words? I rebuke you. I'm ashamed of you. And I will be, even when the last scene is unfolding and I'm returning in glory. Woman wisdom takes a strikingly similar tone with those who want none of what she's offering. Panic, calamity, distress, anguish will be on their plates if they refuse the nourishing feast she's offering. Okay, so we know wisdom, good, scoffing and willful cluelessness, bad. But what exactly is wisdom? O'Connor says that wisdom calls everyone to a radical spirituality, to a way of being in the world and in relationships. But that doesn't quite get at what or who wisdom is. Oprah Winfrey calls wisdom life-changing insights. I don't think that's a bad definition. Another writer names wisdom the ever-searching, ever-calling, ever-challenging Spirit of God. There are many theologians who believe that wisdom is God. Wikipedia defines wisdom as the ability to think and act using knowledge, understanding, experience, common sense, and insight, and further states that it's associated with compassion, experiential self-knowledge, non-attachment, and virtues such as ethics and benevolence. I'm going to steal a phrase from Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart and say we might not be able to define wisdom, but we know it when we see it. Wisdom is knowing what to do, no matter what's just happened. Sometimes that means doing nothing at all. Sometimes it means getting out the iodine and a box of Band-Aids. Sometimes it means waiting while someone pours out their heart to you. Sometimes it means holding your beloved as their heart beats its last. Sometimes it means saying just enough, not too much. You don't have to be old to be wise, but it can help. And yet there's plenty of evidence of children displaying wisdom. And you can definitely be as old as the hills and not display a lick of sense, as I'm sure somebody said in a movie at some point. But where do we start? How do we begin if we want to listen? We can start with the phrase we find kind of buried in our passage. The foolish did not choose the fear of the Lord, which gets a better, more thorough introduction in verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, this is when I would normally downplay that word fear and emphasize other synonyms. But we, my kin in Christ, are entirely powerless in the grand scheme of God's creation. We can take mastery of this or that little domain, but it's not long before dishes in the sink piling up, or the return of the stalks of giant hogweed, or the cranky boss, or the painful alienation from a child, or worse, reminds us we are mostly powerless over most things, if not all of them. And God, the God whom we gather to worship this warm fall day, the one whom we call almighty and sovereign and creator of all that is, from the trees who are turning their bodies into pillars of light to the hills they are making so beautiful. You know where I'm going with this. It makes good sense to tremble just a little bit at the thought of being in the presence of this God, which we are right now and every minute of every day. And even though we are convinced that our God is a loving God, that our God is in fact love, and that also nothing in creation can separate us from the love of this God, even with all these things in view, the fear of the Lord seems reasonable. You might even say wise. Wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. Another way of saying it is wisdom begins with knowing the relative sizes of the universe and yourself. There's a difference between this fear, though, and the fear you get when walking on a street you don't know at night. O'Connor says, fear of the Lord does not mean sniveling in terror before God. The phrase, the fear of the Lord, is an ancient code for the proper behavior of the religious person in relation to God and creation. It involves awe, respect, obedience. It summarizes righteous living. People who fear the Lord have their feet planted on the ground, see around them truthfully, and live in harmony with God and the world. The foolish, by contrast, are abandoned to the fruit of their own way. What Lady Wisdom asks in this passage is that we listen. We have to listen. Wisdom grows in the hearts of those who are listening for it. So we will hear it in the messy melee of everyday life, in the chaos of the grocery store, in the tension of a traffic jam, in the rough and tumble of disagreements with people we love. But we will also hear it in the spaces between those moments, when we remember and evaluate and say, this, not that, and make choices for ourselves. It's these choices that will help us to know our feet are firmly planted on God's beautiful earth and our senses are taking in God's wondrous world accurately, and we are in harmony with God, with one another, and with ourselves. Wisdom grows in our hearts when we listen for it. All she asks is that we listen. Thanks be to God. Amen.